Okay, so I want to welcome everybody to our webinar on collaboration. I'm Judy Carabo, and I'm the Chief Collaborations Officer for Mission+Strategy and the facilitator for today's webinar. So today we're going to get a deeper understanding about the merger between the consulting firm Mission+Strategy and the nonprofit organization Keystone Alliance. And so I'd like to start by introducing Jean Butzen, who's the founder of Mission+Strategy Consulting. It's the largest provider of nonprofit restructuring services in the Midwest. Jean has served as the president and CEO of Lakefront Supportive Housing for 18 years. And in 2005, she led the merger with Mercy Housing. At the end of 2022, Jean once again was at the center of a strategic restructure when she merged her consulting practice, Mission+Strategy, with Keystone Alliance. So I'd like to welcome you, Jean, and thank you for being part of this today.
Thank you, Judy.
And then our next guest is Greg. He is the CEO for Keystone Alliance. Keystone Alliance is the parent organization for two nonprofits that serve the developmental and intellectual disability community. Keystone provides back office services, administrative and strategic support for Glenkirk and Search, as well as contractually with PACT. Mission+Strategy expanded Keystone strategic consulting offerings when they merged at the end of 2022. So welcome, Greg. Thanks for being a part of this webinar.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to just jump right in and start with our first question. So, and this will be for both of you, but Jean, I'm going to ask you to start off answering the question. But from both of your perspectives, tell us a little bit about what prompted you to even begin to talk about a merger between Mission+Strategy and Keystone Alliance. Jean?
Well, like a lot of mergers, Judy, sometimes they're things come together through opportunity, and that was certainly the case here. So in 2022, I had been going through the process of beginning to transition down my business. I was preparing to retire. I had been in a number of conversations with other consulting firms about the possibility of my firm merging with their firms or discussions along those lines, but nothing really ever came together. And so I was prepared to close my business and was moving in that direction when last summer, in the summer of 2022, I should say, I happened to be on a training call with Greg, and it was a positive experience. And so at the end of it, we sort of emailed each other because it was a Zoom call, and said, hey, let's have coffee. And I tell a lot of my clients that's how these things sometimes get started. And so we were having coffee, and Greg was like, hey, what's up? What's going on with your future? And so I decided to share with him that I was getting ready to close my business and retire. And he said, no, that really can't be. And so I said, well, maybe there's something here. And so I asked him if Keystone might be interested in the possibility of acquiring Mission+Strategy, and he was kind of shocked and said yes, he would be very, very interested in the possibility. And so that got us started. So at this point, I think it would be really good to turn it over to Greg and let Greg kind of take it from here and explain what happened.
Yeah, I fell out of my chair and then I got up, and no, it was the scenario where the opportunity for complementary services was the North Star for the Keystone side of the relationship, where we provide back office services from a shared platform, but there's always these needs to have kind of the consultative support for our organizations. And so, I mean, aside from Mission+Strategy's legacy of impact in the sector, it's just really, we're both here to sustain and strengthen nonprofit missions. So from that perspective, it was a very, very naturally complementary and aligned scenario.
Yeah, so it's a really important point I think that you're both making, right? Is that the conversation started off organically, but you were both open to having these conversations, right? And that you looked for ways in which your work could align and actually be able to expand. So I'm going to kind of continue along that same frame and ask you, can you talk a little bit about like some of the steps that you took between the first conversation And then when you ultimately close, just to give our guests this kind of idea, this 50,000-foot view of what this process kind of looked like. What did it look like for both of you?
Well, from my perspective, I was really interested in seeing the work of Mission+Strategy continue. I really felt like it was important work, the work around mergers, collaborations, asset transfers, things like that. I thought that that intense level of consulting work was needed in the sector. And I wanted to see somebody who would continue it, improve it, kind of take it to the next level. And so I began by talking with Greg about where was his organization going, where would these kind of services fit. So I was kind of doing my due diligence about, in these early conversations about what were his intentions around keeping these services alive, and not just alive, but improving them, strengthening them, things along those lines. And so a lot of those early conversations were about vision, the goals, like what would we try and accomplish together? And Greg, what would you say?
Well, just building on that last point, it's almost like we had in our conversations a mini strategic planning process around goals, and we were both coming at it to see if there was mutual space in the middle, and there most certainly was. But I think the shared goal was evident very early. And Judy, to answer your question around the process itself, for Keystone as an existing nonprofit with a governing board, we had many more steps versus Jean as a sole proprietor. So I would say it was probably about 45 days for decision making, but that was spread out over 2 quarterly Keystone board meetings. So we had coffee in June, and then we had the Keystone board officially approve the deal in early December. But there was just a lot of kind of working with board members to make sure they understood what was happening and things of that nature. But again, given the alignment and each of our experience, and Jean's much deeper than Keystone's, but in the merger, acquisition, and strategic collaboration space, it was kind of fun to just say, okay, I'm going to grab the playbook over here and let's follow our own rules. And it was rather straightforward from that perspective.
And we still did things like we wrote a letter of intent, we wrote a memorandum of understanding, and that really kind of helped crystallize what it is we were trying to accomplish and how we were going to get there. And I think it helped Greg's board too to crystallize, what was Greg intending to do with this asset, and to help his staff understand that too. So
Absolutely.
So it sounds like, again, that like you really, Jean, were almost like helping to facilitate this process as you were going through this process, right? Being that facilitator of so many mergers, you were facilitating this process in a way as you went through it. And Greg, the point about kind of, because your organization is a nonprofit governed by a board, the steps that you had to go through that Jean necessarily didn't have to go through.
Absolutely.
So, Jean, you talked about the letter of intent and MOU as steps that you guys took during this process, and that really raises the question: what were some key issues that the two of you had to work out, and were there any stumbling blocks that you guys felt were issues that you really needed to work through, and how did you guys address them?
Well, I think my experience was that it was really rather smooth, but some of the classic challenges in this process are who is going to be the leader after the transaction is complete. How are those things going to work? But given Jean's plans to retire and Keystone's intent around this strategically, those matters were relatively well settled. On our side, I think it was more getting over the surprise of, we have an existing strategic plan within Keystone's 4 walls that we were very deep in the way of executing, and so it was like, we haven't talked about this kind of an opportunity before. This isn't on the plan, but it was an opportunity nonetheless. So really getting getting all of our stakeholders, board members, and senior leadership team folks up to speed. Once they got up to speed, everybody was in agreement this is a wonderful opportunity for us. But I think that was, from the Keystone perspective, the biggest stumbling block.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Jean, what
Yeah,
are your thoughts?
well, I would say there wasn't a huge stumbling block for me, except to know that there was going to be somebody like you, Judy, in the position of Chief Collaboration Officer who was going to be ready, when we closed, to kind of start to execute the strategy. And so I didn't want to close and not have somebody in that position, and then just wait, while we found, while we filled that position. So I think that was the kind of the biggest concern for me. But in general, one way or the other, I knew that I was going to be closing my business down by the end of the year. The timing for when we closed and things like that are normally really big was not as big a concern for me, because I knew what I was doing one way or the other. And so when we closed on the merger was not a huge issue for me.
And I would add that kind of another typical stumbling block that I think wasn't even a stumbling block for us is just communications, processing assumptions, and getting to that shared understanding on things, because there were, around capacity and a variety of other issues, Gene and I would have a conversation, agree, and then walk away with different assumptions, and then come back, check in on those, and see that we weren't exactly on the same paragraph, on the same page. And so luckily we both come to the table as experienced collaborators, so it was not a significant issue to work those out and make sure we walked out of the room with an acutely shared understanding. But I think that's, in my other experiences with these kinds of transactions, that is often where you see friction and sometimes active disagreement that can cause bigger problems.
So there was a lot of time that you guys dedicated to making sure you were aligned in your understanding around some of these issues. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, I mean, communication in general is just, you're always communicating and you're recommunicating and you're,
Yeah.
rephrasing, and circumstances change, and it's this, for me, this is 100% of what I do, and for Greg it's not. He's got 20 things he's juggling, so
Right.
it's
Right.
just the nature of the beast, as they say.
And I think you began to answer this next question, but I also want to just make space for it to really be, talked through and developed, because, there's always things that go well in a merger and you're like, yeah, we did that part right. But there's also things that maybe not have gone as planned. And Greg, you had talked about like this needing to come back and realign. You guys thought you were on the same page, but needed to come back and realign. Can you both talk a little bit more about the things that you thought this went really smoothly? But here's also on the other side the reality, things that might not have gone as planned or might not have been as hoped for. So our audience members can have like this really full picture of what this process is like. It doesn't always go perfectly.
Can I go on that one, Gene?
Yeah.
So I think, there's kind of a variety of standard reasons why one would look to this kind of a relationship. And for Keystone, we were very much aware of the Mission+Strategy legacy, reputation, and most importantly, the impact. In terms of what Keystone was looking to accomplish, we were not broadly, or our market awareness was not nearly at the level that we needed to be to accomplish our goals for growing and things of that nature. Mission+Strategy is very well known in the marketplace. Sub to that, our external communications functions are underdeveloped, and that might be an understatement. And so very much one of the organizational objectives was to learn from the Mission+Strategy communications strategy and experience to grow and inform the Keystone side. But after the transaction, our lack of communications experience has been kind of a continually resurfacing theme. We're finding our way through it, and we're navigating, I think, well from that perspective. But in the area of kind of complementary strengths, offsetting, other organizations' needs to improve. That's the one that I would say probably has caused the most friction for me in this. But again, we're working through it in a positive and productive manner.
Yeah. I think, from my perspective, it's been really interesting going through a merger again. I've seen my clients go through it so many times, but I think what you forget when you're the entity that's being absorbed by another organization, just, as important as you are to the other organization's got 100 priorities. And they have to manage all of those priorities. And so you have to, you have to be patient. You have to be, you have to understand this is day one of 2.0. It's not, you think you're going to hit the ground running, but you're not. You're going to, you have to see it as the new era. And in that sense, it's like everything slows down again, which can be extremely frustrating. But at the same time, it's really necessary. It just is necessary. And I don't have a really good analogy for that, but it's, everybody's got to get to know. It's like you go from one to to a full complement, a full team, and everybody's got to figure out how to do all these things together. But then once they do, the impact is going to be significant. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
I think that is something, and like over the last couple of months, I've had to like tell myself a couple of times.
Yeah, those are some really great reflections from both of you about this process. Great.
Just one more to add on to it, which was, I think, is a structural element of mergers and acquisitions that's generally true, is on the Keystone side, we were very focused on making sure the final transaction was planned and correct and then executed accordingly. Then the work on the other side to start the transition process, maybe it's superstition, but I've seen other scenarios where you start doing the after work and it confounds the ability to execute the actual acquisition or merger transaction. And so I think that was the other thing, is we wanted to keep a relatively small circle of people who were aware of it, just in case something got wobbly and the final transaction didn't get executed as planned, so that we weren't at a full stop on the other side of the transaction, but it was a very slow roll to get up to speed. And I think that's just, again, you can handle it a variety of different ways, but from the Keystone side, we were very focused on making sure that everything was buttoned, and then we started going versus trying to work in parallel.
Yep, that makes total sense. So to continue on this kind of reflective part of this webinar, there's been a lot of literature that talks about the technical process of a merger and a strategic partnership, and there's not necessarily as much on the human emotions that people experience as you're going through the merger on either side of the equation, right? And so Jean, you already started talking about some of that, like with the frustration about how things kind of slow back down. Can you both talk a little bit more about some of the feelings, reactions, expectations you've experienced through this process?
I have an answer. Would you like me to go, or do you want to go first, Jean?
I'll go first this time. I mean, I wouldn't say that this situation has only been positive for me. It hasn't really been kind of like a traditionally emotional, merger like you would experience in a lot of organizations. Like I have experienced my first merger, hugely emotional for me, letting go. This has been comparatively extremely happy, extremely joyful, because I went from a one-person organization to a full team, and I can really play out, just how quickly the benefits are going to accrue here. And So I wouldn't say that this has been, a sad experience at all. I feel like it's been extremely positive.
The only issue is she wants to retire at some point, and we don't want her to. So that's I think that's the only negative dynamic thus far. But I think going back to the communication um, kind of dynamics that we were talking about before, it's almost like an interpersonal version of merging cultures. And there's you can plan for it, you can be open-minded about it, and it's just there is that learning when you really start to integrate of, okay, this is how you have to just get used to the rhythms of it. And again, I'll echo what Jean said, that it's been uniformly positive from the Keystone perspective. But Jean is, her literal day job is being a collaborator. Keystone has a collaborative model. So I think, the odds of us finding ways to work together should be pretty high, and the experience has definitely reflected that as well.
So we've talked a lot about, or you've talked a lot about the merger between Mission+Strategy and Keystone Alliance, and I want to do a little bit of a pivot here, and really talk more globally for the next few minutes. And so, I think really the question that I'm interested in hearing both of your responses around are kind of like, why are strategic partnerships and mergers even important for nonprofits to even begin to consider?
Well, what I would say is that it's important to remember that mergers and partnerships are a strategy. So they're a means to an end. So all strategies are important for nonprofit organizations to consider, only from the perspective of, will they help a nonprofit organization achieve their strategic goals better than any other strategy? And in some cases, that is going to be true. Not in every case, but I think it's important for organizations to evaluate merger and collaboration strategies when they are doing strategic planning, when there's a CEO transition that's happening in those situations, just to be aware, to evaluate them, to see, would this strategy help us achieve our goals better than any other strategy? So, and when organizations do that, when they're familiar with those strategies, there may come a time when they decide, yes, it would be better, but it's helpful to have the experience of becoming familiar with the strategies before that time occurs. Also, you may be approached at some time by another organization who would come to you and ask, would you consider a merger or some type of partial consolidation strategy? And it's helpful to have the experience of evaluating these strategies before that occurs, so that you have the familiarity with them. And when the answer might be yes, we would like to evaluate them, an organization may decide that it's a really good strategy for their nonprofit organization. And I would encourage you to really do the due diligence and really pursue it, at least from the perspective of understanding what's best for my nonprofit organization. And if the answer is it's best, to actually, go through the process and do what's best for your nonprofit. So I've done it. Many people have done it. When it's best for the people you serve, for your employees, for your communities, it can be a really excellent strategy.
I agree. I'm shocked. But I think looking at it from the other angle, the operating environment for any nonprofit organization is getting more difficult by the moment. Pandemics, never-ending funding crises, being in the state of Illinois with all of our idiosyncratic problems, you add it up, and the demands on an organization and its senior leadership and its board are mounting to the point where a strategic collaboration solution helps you get the resources, intelligence, and in some cases scale together to best execute your mission. And I just want to say out loud that going through this process has been really validating from the perspective of that mission sustainability and mission alignment. That's ultimately why you're entering into this. What's the best thing to do for the communities, populations, and people that we're serving? And again, in today's day and age, looking at this and understanding whether it's for you or not is something that should be on people's menu.
Yeah, and Greg, that's such a good point. Let me just add, when organizations are attempting to achieve strategic results, here are the things they most often are looking for. They're looking for geographic expansion, serving more lives, and sometimes more diverse lives, like children, families, and adults, youth, so on. They're looking to expand their infrastructure, so much deeper and better quality information technology, outcome evaluation, human resources, finance and accounting, just to name a few things that you can get from infrastructure. And they're looking for better benefits and salary structures for their employees so that they can retain their employees, better training, better mobility for their employees than they're able to provide for their workforce right now. So this is just a sampling of some of the things, and then we could go on and talk about licensure and a continuum of services, a diversity of services. These are things that very often organizations cannot get on their own, or it would take years and years and years of effort to get on their own. Very often, these are the benefits, and there are multiple benefits that they get from doing a merger or a merger type of transaction.
So our last question for this webinar is around the kind of like last pieces of advice you might have for organizations. You both have some wonderful experience firsthand with partnerships and mergers. Jean, over 70 strategic partnerships you've facilitated and helped negotiate. So what would be any kind of words of advice in any part of the process that you would have for nonprofit leaders considering a merger strategy?
Well, my advice is that you should be very patient. Don't feel like you have to rush to a decision, but also don't be quick to stop a conversation when you hit the first bump in the road. My clients who have been most successful are the people who really, really, really are patient with the boards, with the individuals who are involved. Sometimes they go for a year or more in a process in order to get the results that they're looking for. And the other advice I would get is, don't neglect the staff, particularly the management staff. Think about your culture, think about what the expectations are about involving them in the process and the decisions around these kinds of transactions. The board is extremely important, and if you don't have the board on board, then you really cannot do a transaction like this, and particularly the board chair is extremely important. The board chair and the CEO almost have to be locked at the hip in order for this to really work, but you need the support of a majority, if not all, of the board in order to take these strategies forward. And so you need the early support of the board in order for you to take this step by step as you go through the process. Don't neglect your key funders. Your key funders see themselves as partners in the process. And so you need to be communicating with them about what your intentions are. That doesn't make them decision makers, but they do want to be kept informed. And I'm talking about your biggest funders. Particularly government funders have to be handled extremely carefully. And finally, this is something that can't be entered into lightly. And so you need to really research the strategy and do your due diligence carefully when it comes time. And Greg, what would you add to that list?
Oh, very little. That covers the ground very well. I would just go back to your previous response, Jean, about the different reasons to think about this strategic approach. And it needs to be mission first. You need to be looking to capacity build or fill in gaps or things along those lines. Very often you hear about one side winning, which implies the other side is losing, which sets it in a competitive frame. And I think that is just off base. There's so much more need for impact than the current nonprofit community could ever supply, that getting together is the way to do it, and being collaborative instead of competitive is really the way to go. But obviously we're a little biased.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking your time to do this webinar, and just the wisdom of your firsthand experience, but also kind of the experience that you've garnered over the years and really helped guiding people as they consider mergers and partnerships as a strategic option. Thank you both so much for your time.